Hello everyone, today's March 4th, 2025. It happens to be the first day of the trade war, but let's not focus on that too much right now. I have a different idea in mind for a video today, and mostly this has to do with the fact that we are heading into eclipse season. Amongst everything else that is going on in the astrological world, there are still eclipses, and this is unique in the sense that it's going to be the first of a series of eclipses in the Virgo-Pisces axis. And as I do this video, Mercury has just ingressed recently into Aries, leaving Pisces, but we still have the Sun, we still have Saturn, we still have Neptune, all in Pisces. My last video was talking about how Neptune is going to be ingressing into Aries as well. So I figured basically, while we still have a big lineup of planets in Pisces, and while we're heading into this Virgo-Pisces eclipse season, and mind you, each nodal cycle lasts about 18 months. So we're at the beginning of a new nodal cycle. There's something about the whole archetype of Pisces, especially when you consider that we have Saturn and Neptune there, and how Neptune is closely associated with the archetype of the Redeemer, got me thinking a lot about this book called Aion by Carl Jung. And this book has a bit of a notorious reputation because this is one book that Jordan Peterson says that he is absolutely freaked out by. Possibly because, Jordan Peterson calls himself a Jungian, bases his whole perspective around Carl Jung. But Jung himself was a Christian and an astrologer, and somebody who wrote this book about the precession of the equinoxes. And it's interesting, first of all, because from one thing, there's an issue with all of this, which is whether or not astrology is real, whether or not the precession of the equinoxes is real. And there is some kind of what I'm not going to sort of like debunk the precession of the equinoxes in this video, because I've already done that, or there's enough stuff on that itself, but there's some basic difference between this book and the kind of people, listening to people who you would take to be reliable authorities on astrology. Basically, in this book, Carl Jung is a lot more. There's a lot about this which is about the precession of the equinoxes and about the coming age of Aquarius. And there's a whole debate around first you have to accept that astrology itself is real, or that if you just write off astrology altogether, it doesn't really matter if the question of whether or not an age of Aquarius is real or not doesn't really have much value or import. Right? But if you, so first we have to start from this premise that we do believe in astrology. And then, for whatever reason, when Carl Jung was writing this book, there was he had much more of a reason to believe that, basically, that there was some traditional basis for believing in the precession of the equinoxes corresponding with these big zodiacal ages, right? And in recent times, there seems to be a kind of a change of opinion where most people, regardless of whether, you could just believe in the age of Aquarius anyways, but like the question is, did it ever have this sort of historical underpinning or not, right? Where did the people thousands of years ago believe in this? There are better. I'll put a link in the comments because I think Astrology Podcast did a pretty definitive episode on this, and if you want, if you want the straight story on it, just it's better to listen to that than anything I'm going to be able to do for you. But nonetheless, I think there's some kind of like underlying thing about the age of Aquarius, in especially in context to the fact that there are other kinds of astrological ages which are not as popular or well known about, including this one where we're having the grand conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn in air signs, and that we have Pluto in Aquarius. And there's something about how the age of Aquarius has more kind of like recognition value in pop culture than these other ages. But there's something about, like, even if the age of Aquarius is somehow wrong or incorrect, that there's still some sort of, there could be an underlying truth of it, in the sense that I've just been thinking recently about how part of why astrology seems like it's helpful is that going through life, it seems like there's so many things that we have to go through that are stubbornly resistant to change, or the certain structures that have been here since we've been born and established themselves as if they are some kind of inherent reality to just the way things are. But if these are things that have only come about through historical circumstances that are themselves not even really all that old, there's this question of sort of building the basis for your reality on this kind of ever-changing quicksand, right? There's a sense of constant movement and change and stuff like that. And to consider the whole issue of human resilience and adaptability, that human beings, in order to, that we have to somehow be able to adapt to the changes in life, but we seem that we are living in, it was as if you're able to zoom in and zoom out, and that we live our life as if we were like a flea on a dog, right? Like, imagine if we were just like these, like your dog has fleas and they're so small that maybe you don't even notice them, but to the perspective of the flea, that's like your whole world, right? It's just living on the fur of this animal. And that if, like, you don't have any sort of like degree of scope to understand that, like, what it would be to evolve away from this tiny little flea life that you're in, right? Like, maybe there's another world out there and you don't have to live like this, right? But there's some kind of, and there's the sense of, like, I guess you could say postmodernism seems to be closely connected or tied into this sort of sense that we don't, on one hand, we don't live a restrictive, limiting, confining life where we're limited to this really narrow, tiny little reality that we have. We've gone through this process of liberation where there's supposedly all sorts of options available to us. That we have all sorts of options that our ancestors didn't have, that have been granted to us by a technological revolution and by a revolution in understanding the very nature of what it means to be a person, as a free individual in society. And then there's a kind of a new, people kind of, our ancestors saw this change that we were going through and basically came up with a story about a coming of a new age that was filled with all kinds of hope and optimism and idealism, about what kind of utopian future might lie ahead after we've all been limited by the previous restrictive forms of society, and the sort of myth that usually the age of Aquarius is associated with a lot of optimism for this reason, but there's also a sense that it could be related to not with optimism, but instead of kind of, I mean, well, if we look at what this, if we forget about the age of Aquarius and actually look at this Pluto and Aquarius stuff, it's not, Pluto itself is not the most optimistic kind of planet to be making a transit through Aquarius, and that Pluto and Aquarius energy does not, it didn't really lend itself to a kind of utopian optimism that we might associate with it, the kind of dream of a better tomorrow with an age of Aquarius. And there's also this sort of interesting thing in all of this where the precession of the equinox goes backwards, where the idea is that that it goes to Aquarius after Pisces, when the motion of the planets in the zodiac goes the other way. So there's kind of so this is kind of strange because it's like the supposed progress or evolution of an age of Aquarius is actually regressive in the sense of the context of the way the zodiac normally moves. And so then you could also extrapolate from this that if the precession of the equinoxes continued, and then you had an age of Capricorn after that, and an age of Sagittarius after that, it would not necessarily be a cycle that led to states of more and more development, but a kind of strange regression, right? And so there's also this kind of weird question when it comes to kinds of things like what Carl Jung was doing, which was trying to like pioneer a kind of evolution of the consciousness that involved looking back in time into these old myths and legends and things which have become antiquated, like alchemy and astrology and things which are considered not scientific. That is this essentially stepping into a new era, or is this essentially just regressing back to some sort of magical thinking, right? That there's some sort of magical thinking that comes with primitive societies that we're supposed to be evolving, but really we are devolving, right? As in the name of the band Devo. That was their whole joke, was that the progress of society, the evolution of society was more of a regress. And that this is also, I should mention that I had recently finished reading this book, Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media, and I often, like, when it comes to, like, Neptune stuff, I use this idea of McLuhan, because McLuhan had Sun conjunct Neptune. So he's he was also a very visionary kind of guy, and this is a kind of like this looks like a book, but really this is a sophisticated piece of visionary future prophesizing technology in the form of a paperback book, but it holds a certain capacity that other books don't have, right? The OG copy of Understanding Media. And one of the things that McLuhan tries to illustrate in this book is that there's a kind of a dual motion going on, where there is simultaneously a kind, what he calls an implosion as well as an explosion, and that the whole idea between the implosion and the explosion is that the process of the medium of typography, or the whole idea, because it's kind of funny also this idea of types, because astrology sometimes gets a bad reputation because it is seen as a kind of a reductive system of typologies, right? In the same way that, like, the Myers-Briggs test was something that came out of Carl Jung's thinking and became a way to sort of reduce a fairly complex view of psychology into a fairly reductive system of creating a bunch of types that you either fit into or you don't, and you have these little character profiles, and astrology is just a way to repeat that with zodiac signs. This is a reductive and overly simplistic way of understanding astrology. But part of the inherent, there's a certain reaction that a lot of people have, that they don't like astrology, or they don't like Myers-Briggs, or they don't like typology, because they sense that the whole process of typing, of stereotyping, of creating categories and labels that section people off into different categories and box them in with labels, that there's this sense that this is inherently a fragmentary process. And that McLuhan basically described the whole literate culture as being essentially fragmentary, because the idea of the medium of literature, if you consider, let's say, a library situation where, of course, everybody has to be quiet as to not disturb the reading and studying. You have a massive library with all kinds of desks and books and students, and each of these students in the library setting is highly individualized. Each of the library goers is reading their own book, studying their own material in a way where they are able to engage in a highly individualized activity. They could be working all day on something that doesn't concern the whole crowd of people around them, right? If you consider that, in contrast to taking let's say, a seminar where somebody is giving a lecture to a class or something like that, you have a situation where you have a whole auditorium of people whose attention is focused on one speaker, right? So you have a collective experience where you have a crowd collected to listen to a live lecturer, or you have a very fragmentary, divided experience where you have a whole bunch of people each studying their own material in their individualized way, right? So the idea here is that there are certain types of media, or certain, but it could be the content of both the lecture and the book could be the same, right? That you can have, somebody could give a lecture or give a talk and have that transcribed and printed into a book, and so the same information, the same material could get across in either setting, right? So there's this kind of idea where in McLuhan's time, when he's talking about the recent invention or the recent popularization of television, which at the time of that book being published, it had been around for about a decade, and it was the way he describes television is in a way that it's like almost unrecognizable to the television that we have today, in that you have a limited number of channels. The resolution is so poor. We probably have better resolution on our phones now than what we had resolution back then. And so he describes this kind of very involving participatory thing where you had to actively try to interpret what this fuzzy image was on the screen. And because you had a limited number of channels, you had you had this sort of sense of like the whole, everybody tuning into the same station and everybody participating and trying to decipher what this crappy TV image was, and everybody sort of being homogenized into the same mass culture, right? So what's interesting is that the media, a lot of what he's doing in this book is balancing these two movements, where you had one movement that was basically fragmenting people and individualizing them, and another movement which was unifying them and bringing them together, right? And so there's this question about, when you apply these ideas to modern technology, that is our use of the internet bringing us together so that we're all basically tuning into the same information stream, or is it dividing us in the same way that we're all just reading different books and we're getting different information streams, to the point where we're all hyper individualized even if we're sharing the same collective space? Which is interesting, because I recently I came across a certain YouTuber who is a kind of indicative of a younger generation. This person, I'm pretty sure, was either genderqueer or transgender or non-binary or something like that, and maybe seemed to be maybe a bit neurodivergent or something like that. And this person was describing, it was interesting, kind of quaint. This young person was describing their experience at their first rave party. It would make, of course, making me feel like a bit of a geezer. But they were describing it in terms of, it was interesting because I will be able to link to this as well. That this person was describing their first experience at a rave party as being hyper individualized, in the sense that if you go to the rave, there are all sorts of different groups of people that apparently share no sense of social cohesion to each other, but at least perhaps agree enough on music, or at least interest in EDM or techno or whatever it may be. They are willing enough to share the same space and dance to the same DJ, but it doesn't have the same coherence that I'm assuming people would associate with a, if you went to go see the band and, everybody is a fan of the same rock and roll band. But to be honest, there's something about this where I distinctively remember. I mean, I don't rave, I don't party as much as I used to, but when a lot of my experience with this came from when I was a young person, living in my early 20s, living in the city, going out to parties and stuff like that, there was a sense that if you were to go to a rock show, a punk rock show or something like that, you could kind of, like, there was a certain crowd associated with a certain kind of music, and there was a very sort of a sense of a kind of like an in-group kind of situation around specific kind of styles and how you dressed and stuff like that. But when it came to electronic music and the rave, there was a strange kind of sense of this being just like, what can you say? There was a local techno crew called Subversive, which there's a sense of something subversive about the whole thing, because in that there's a sense of like going against this whole, like, being saturated with this kind of message that, like, first of all, it's not real music. It's just repetitive loops that are kind of annoying. You had to be on drugs for it to sound good. And that people with real talent would make like rock and roll or play in a more sophisticated kind of band. And so there's something about how it's like, and it's also, maybe a lot of gay people like to go clubbing or something. So it's kind of queer. So there's a certain sense of, and it's also kind of maybe associated, like its origins in like queer black culture or something like that. So there's automatically this kind of thing where it's like, by going to the rave, you're kind of like going astray, because there's a certain sense of what is considered to be valued in the society that you're part of, but you are escaping that subjectivity into and then there's this opportunity in that other area where you can like party and take drugs that all basically promise a certain attraction or appeal, because they're a release from this extremely kind of repressive and oppressive kind of subjectivity that says you have to like this kind of music, you have to men, if you dance and you're a man, you must be like gay or something. Or, what I'm saying? There's all these sorts of like messages or all these kinds of scripts that are really oppressive. And there's this sense of like, by going to a rave party, you're breaking the rules, and you are, there with all sorts of freaky people that are also breaking that rule of what is supposed to be appropriate or something like that, right? And there's something about, I think with the rave, there's also this kind of thing where there are just typical club goers. And from the position of being an indie kid, this is kind of a novelty, because you're also, instead of having to be burdened by trying to like, I don't know, somehow make friends with the right people in the right crowd, you're just in there with a whole bunch of idiots. And you don't even really care necessarily what people think, right? You're just there to party, right? And so you're kind of liberated from the social pressure of trying to impress people too, right? And there's this kind of like there's a sort of liberating kind of potential in the rave scene, but there's something that's also maybe like hyper individualistic about it, because that liberation doesn't never at any point in time gives you a point to position yourself in and call this place a place where you can call home. You're just passing through. You're just bar hopping and you stumbled in and you're having a good time. But there's no real sense that this is where you belong. Aside, but it does give you a reprieve from the. It's often described as a kind of a sanctuary, right? Like you've got a sanctuary that gives you a space where you can just feel like you're allowed to be yourself. When you've got all these other in the outside world, people will tell you that your music is gay, or that this is your whole personality isn't supposed to work with this or whatever, right? Like it's supposed to be a kind of a liberation away from that, right? Contrast that to, let's say, I went to Australia for a while, and they have this whole Psytrance scene that I always associated with Australians, because you only find out about Psytrance parties in Canada from Australian tourists who are just looking for some place to go for Psytrance. Like the Psytrance scene in Canada seems like it's mainly set up to cater to tourists who are thrown off by the inherent lack of Psytrance in the environment, right? So when you as a tourist go to some other country, they have this whole scene of a certain genre that isn't really. It seems like it's like you get a unique experience that you wouldn't be able to have at home around. And part of that, when you talk to the people who are just make that their lifestyle, like this is what they do. They're just in it to go to Psytrance festivals and to like DJ and do this kind of stuff. They have this mentality that when they're at the Psytrance festival, that when they're taking their drugs and stuff like that, it's a boundary dissolving experience, or that they experience a sense of continual unity between them and their friends on the dance floor. And there could be, I don't know, maybe there are sometimes there's a bad reputation or a certain bad rap that comes from the idea of like rich kids on LSD, but there's a certain kind of like, you can tell that there may be different, there might be people that are more like bogans or more like working class, and there might be people that are more like spoiled rich, but they're all partying and they're all just there to have a good time, and they don't let class distinction. There's a certain appreciation that if you are some rich kid and your Land Rover gets stuck in the mud, you're going to need to be friends with the redneck, because he's going to be the one pulling you out of the mud. So you when your vehicle gets stuck, right? So there's a sense that the boundary dissolving is also a dissolution of class boundaries, that people of different classes can come together for a shared love of Psytrance, and experience the whole dance floor as an interconnective, just one continual sludge beast of like pheromones and smells and dreadlocks and whatever. And there's this is the sense of unification that is off. Why am I talking with this in with this video is with the Pisces and Neptune, and the sort of like boundary dissolving unification, and this kind of like sense of the pressure, the ecstasy that releases you from the burden of your identity, that says because you're this and this person, you're not allowed to, like, if you dance, that means you're like a gay person, and we don't, and you have to keep this really straight hetero uptight kind of like there's this kind of like this so you release from that, and you experience this kind of unification with the crowd. But what's interesting is that there's this kind of, to listen to the young generation, what they describe is a hyper-individualized environment where they don't experience any unification at all in a rave party. They just experience them perhaps even more, even especially if you go there as like a trans kid and you just experience all these different groups of strangers, and you don't have the sense that everybody just supports you to just like get freaky and be who you are. It's like you don't know, you have all sorts of different groups of people with their own micro identity and no sense of social cohesion with any of them, and it being extremely fragmented, but also some kind of unity, some kind of unification, because why else would they all be in the same room, right? And so there's this kind of weird paradox where like the things that we used to expect to be things that would give us a sense of like tribal belonging, like we all do this thing together, we all have the sense of belonging to the same in-group. This apparently only emphasizes how fragmented and isolated and claustrophobically paranoid and insecure we feel about interacting with other people, that we can't even like experience this sort of like we're all just one big party and there's no, and we're all just, we're all embracing each other. Instead, it's like you go there and you feel like it's your crew versus this crew versus this crew, and nobody gets along, right? And this is without even bringing into like where these divisions are, right? There's a sense of having a more divided society, right? Okay, maybe I'm a bit confused. I'm just going into more, maybe I'm going intuitively on this one. I'm going to read a little bit from Carl Jung's Aion. Again, this is a book which I picked this book up over 10 years ago, and I still haven't read it. I'm not even that far on it. But there's something about this book that I thought I'd read for the sake of understanding this sort of Neptune archetype, this Pisces archetype, all this stuff that might as well talk about Pisces while we got some planets there before, see as a way to show like a one last, or to talk about Neptune and Pisces before we enter into this Neptune and Aries period, right? So I'm just going to read from this, and we'll just see what happens. Let us now turn back to the theme of Christ as the fish. According to Dolger, the Christian fish symbol first appeared in Alexandria around AD 200. Similarly, the baptismal bath was described as a piscina, a fish pond, quite early. This presupposes that the believers were fishes, as in fact suggested by the Gospels, for instance, Matt 4:19. There Christ wants to make Peter and Andrew fishers of men. And the miraculous drought of fishes, Luke 5:10, is used by Christ himself as a paradigm for Peter's missionary activity. A direct astrological aspect of Christ's birth is given us in Matthew 2. The Magi from the east were stargazers who, beholding an extraordinary constellation, inferred an equally extraordinary birth. This anecdote proves that Christ, possibly even at the time of the apostles, was viewed from the astrological standpoint, or at least brought into connection with astrological myths. The later alternative is fully confirmed when we consider the apocalyptic utterances of St. John. Since this exceedingly complex question has been discussed by those who are more qualified than I, we can support our argument on the well-attested fact that glimpses of astrological mythology may be caught behind the stories of the worldly and otherworldly life of the Redeemer. Above all, it is the connections with the age of the fishes which are attested by the fish symbolism, either contemporaneously with the Gospels themselves, fishers of men, fishermen as the first disciples, miracle of loaves and fishes, or immediately afterwards in the post-apostolic era. The symbolism shows Christ and those who believe in him as fishes, fish as the food eaten at the agape, baptism as immersion in a fish pond, etc. At first sight, all this points to no more than the fact that the fish symbols and mythologiums, which have always existed, have assimilated the figure of the Redeemer. In other words, it was a symptom of Christ's assimilation into the world of ideas prevailing at that time. But to the extent that Christ was regarded as the new Aion, it would be clear to anyone acquainted with astrology that he was born as the first fish of the Pisces era, and was doomed to die as the last ram of the declining Aries era. Matthew 27:15 hands down this mythologium in the form of the old sacrifice of the seasonal god. Significantly enough, Jesus' partner in the ceremony is called Barabbas, son of the Father. There would be some justification for drawing a parallel between the tension of opposites in early Christian psychology and the fact that zodiacal sign for Pisces frequently shows two fishes moving in opposite directions, but only if it could be proved that their contrary movement dates from pre-Christian times or is at least contemporary with Christ. Unfortunately, I know of no pictorial representation from this period that would give us any information about the position of the fishes. In fine bas relief of the zodiac from the little metropolis in Athens, Pisces and Aquarius are missing. There is one representation of the fishes near the beginning of our era that is certainly free from Christian influence. This is the globe of the heavens from the Farnese Atlas in Naples. The first fish depicted north of the equator is vertical with its head pointing to the celestial pole. The second fish south of the equator is horizontal with its head pointing west. The picture follows the astronomical configuration, is therefore naturalistic. The zodiac from the temple of Hathor at Denera, 1st century BC, shows the fishes, but they both face the same way. The planisphere of the Timocharis, whatever that means, mentioned by Hipparchus, is the only one fish where Pisces should be. On coins and gems from the time of the emperors, and also on Mithraic monuments, the fish are shown either facing the same way or moving in opposite directions. The polarity with which the fishes later acquired may perhaps be due to the fact that the astronomical constellation shows the first northerly fish as vertical and the second southerly as horizontal, and they move almost at right angles to one another and hence form a cross. This counter movement, which was unknown to the majority of the oldest sources, was much emphasized in Christian times, and this leads one to suspect a certain tenditiousness. Although no connection of any kind can be proved between the figure of Christ and the inception of the astrological age of the fishes, the simultaneity of the fish symbolism of the Redeemer with the astrological symbol of the new Aeon seems to me important enough to warrant the emphasis we place upon it. If we try to follow up the complicated mythological ramifications of this parallel, we do so with the intent to throw light on the multifarious aspects of an archetype that manifests itself on one hand in a personality and on the other hand synchronistically in a moment of time determined in advance before Christ's birth. Indeed, but long before that, the archetype had been written in the heavens by projection, so as then, when the time was fulfilled, to coincide with the symbols produced by the new era. The fish, appropriately enough, belongs to the winter rainy season, like Aquarius and Capricorn, as a zodiacal sign. Therefore, it is not in the least remarkable. It becomes a matter for astonishment only when, through the precession of the equinoxes, the spring point moves into this sign and thus inaugurates an age in which the fish was used as a name for the God who became a man. who was born as a fish and was sacrificed as a ram, who had fishermen for disciples and wanted to make them fishers of men, who fed the multitude with miraculously multiplying fishes, who was himself eaten as a fish, the holier food, and whose followers are little fishes, the Pisciculi. Assume, if you would like, that a fairly widespread knowledge of astrology would account for at least some of this symbolism in certain Gnostic Christian circles. But this assumption does not apply when it comes to eyewitness accounts in the Synoptic Gospels. There is no evidence of any such thing. We have no reason whatever to suppose that these stories are disguised astrological myths. On the contrary, one gets the impression that the fish episodes are entirely natural happenings and that there is nothing further to be looked for behind them. They are just so stories, quite simple and natural, and one wonders whether the whole Christian fish symbolism may not have come about equally fortuitously and without premeditation. Hence, one could speak just as well, seemingly fortuitous coincidence of the symbolism with the name of the new Aion, the more and so as the age of the fishes seems to have left no very clear traces in the culture of the East. I could not maintain with any certainty that this is correct because I know too little about Indian and Chinese astrology. As against this, the fact that the traditional fish symbolism makes possible a verifiable prediction that had already been made in the New Testament is a somewhat uncomfortable proposition to swallow. The northerly or easterly fish, which is the spring point entered at about the beginning of our era, is joined to the southerly or westerly fish by the so-called commissure. This consists of a band of faint stars forming the middle sector of the constellation, and the spring point gradually moved along its southern edge. The point where the ecliptic intersects with the meridian at the tail of the second fish coincides roughly with the 16th century, the time of the Reformation, which, as we know, is so extraordinarily important to the history of Western symbols. Since then, the spring point has moved along the southern edge of the second fish and will enter Aquarius in the course of the third millennium. And there's a footnote here which I will get back to. Astrologically interpreted, the designation of Christ as one of the fishes identifies him with the first fish, the vertical one. Christ is followed by the Antichrist at the end of time. The beginning of the enantiodromia would fall logically midway between the two fishes. We have seen that this is so. The time of the Renaissance begins in the immediate vicinity of the second fish, and with it comes that spirit which culminates in the modern age. So the footnote says, since the delimitation of the constellations is known to be somewhat arbitrary, this date is very indefinite. It refers to the actual constellation of fixed stars, not to the zodion noaton, i.e. the zodiac divided into sections of 30 degrees each. Astrologically, the beginning of the next Aion, according to the starting point you select, starts between 80, 2000 and 2200. Starting from star 0 and assuming a Platonic month of 2,143 years, one would arrive at AD 2,154 for the beginning of the Aquarian Age, and at AD 1997 if you start from the star A113. The latter date agrees with the longitude of the stars in Ptolemy's Almagest. So, in my own attempt to calculate this, I tend to go more with the first date that Carl Jung references. He basically creates this with it, using the star marking the beginning of Aquarius that puts the beginning of the age Aquarius at the year 2143. However, Carl Jung is saying that there's also a certain arbitrariness to this marker, and with a certain wiggle room, you could find another star to use that apparently means that the age of Aquarius started in 1997, meaning that we are already in the age of Aquarius now. But this is not really the topic of the video that I wanted to focus on. But I thought it'd be interesting just to point that out, the second date, that if you do take the 1997 date as the beginning of the age of Aquarius, at least with this date, it means that the age of Aquarius started when Neon Genesis Evangelion came out. But there is something in all of this where he talks about, Carl Jung makes this argument that the two fishes in the constellation of Pisces looks like one fish is vertical and the other is horizontal, and that the symbol of Christ as fish is being associated with the Piscean age. Inherently, you get the sense of a dualism between the vertical and the horizontal, or this idea that you have the dualism between heaven and earth, or the dualism between being and non-being, or the dualism between yin and yang, or Cartesian dualism, or the dualism between good and evil. There's all kinds of dualism that you could play with to understand what Carl Jung is trying to get at with this whole Piscean age. And he makes the argument that the Renaissance started when the spring equinox point had crossed over from one fish to the other, and that they're switching from one kind of dualism to another kind of dualism, and that he also sort of tries, for some reason Carl Jung is all about this thing about like resolving the tension of the opposites, or the tension of this dualism, and that like we have between one thing and the other thing, we have the symbol of Christ, but that this symbol has been, basically the whole idea of the precession of the equinoxes is that eventually this symbol becomes worn out and corrupted. I've also been listening to them talks about Nietzsche, and there's this idea from Nietzsche saying that the values that we have, we could consider them to be like coins which are printed with faces, the way that you have the king's face or the queen's face on a coin, or heads and tails, and that eventually the face wears off and you're just left with the raw metal, but it doesn't tell you what country's currency this is and what value it is. It's just a raw piece of metal with no imprint on it. And there's this kind of sense that the myth of the precession of the equinoxes is basically that the whole Christian religion is like a coin which has lost its face. There is still some sort of raw chunk of thing that's left, but it doesn't mean what it used to mean. And I think this is also kind of telling when you get to this, when trying to read Nietzsche, and it's sort of like, it's kind of a strange thing to do, because a lot of Nietzsche's arguments against Christianity describes a Christianity which doesn't really seem to exist anymore. Because it seems more common that people associate Christianity with this kind of like what you would say Protestant like prosperity gospel or something like that, where people somehow adapt their own will to power to that Jesus loves them, and that the more successful they are just goes to show how in alignment they are with the truth of Jesus, rather than saying that they're the sort of self-deprecating oh, what a lowly wretch I am, and how I am nothing compared to the glory, all this. There seems to be this sort of like inversion of values where trying to read Nietzsche is extremely difficult, because his Christian ideal does not even seem to remotely resemble what most people associate with Christianity, right? And I think it's also kind of bizarre, in fact, when you consider there's even a kind of an accelerationist Christianity, which takes a kind of a Christian ideal as being a kind of a vehicle which is going to provide people with a certain sort of security and stability to protect their own kind of autonomy or will to power in troubling times when there's nothing about, the poor and the needy and the lowest among us and turning the other cheek, or it seems like there's something very strange about trying to read Nietzsche, because it's like the ideal he is trying to criticize seems like the argument he's trying to make is what has adapted itself into the status quo of just like rational secular society, is that we have a world that is inherently Nietzschean, and it doesn't, it's not built upon the order of like a god who comes down to sacrifice himself. It's about the competition of a whole bunch of, people trying to like claw themselves up to the top. And, if the people at the bottom suffer, then, that's their own fault, because God helps those who helps themselves, right? It's become, if you need to go so far to call this current form of Christianity the Antichrist, that to me just seems melodramatic, right? I don't know if that's what bothers Jordan Peterson so much about Carl Jung's Aion. This gets me distracted into a whole conversation about the precession of the equinoxes, but I think there's still some argument to be made for Pisces, and specifically about because Neptune, in the Liz Green book, talk about Neptune and the astrological Neptune and the quest for redemption. It's all about a mysticism that overcomes the separation inherent in dualism, right? The idea that there's a fusion of overcoming the separation between heaven and earth, or the separation between man and God, or like I was saying, with going to a Psytrance party and you feel yourself fused with all the people that are partying, like you're just one big glob of this thing, right? And there's a sense of that being somehow in the current, what I'm trying to say, like listening to the young people talk about what their first rave experience is like, and they're not describing a unity, a peace, love, unity, respect, unity experience of transcending the boundaries and having this kind of fusion with the other. What they are describing is an intensification of fragmentation, an intensification of individualism, of a hyper-individualized, that you go into this thing and you come out even more individualized than you were before, right? And I'm basically thinking that in terms of what we have for us right now with the astrology and Saturn and Neptune and Pisces, there's this problem with a Saturn and Neptune conjunction. Because Saturn and Neptune wants fusion, Neptune wants to transcend the limit, whereas Saturn is the limit. Saturn is the lead weight of this gravitational force that keeps you so weighed down to the ground that it seems that the heaven is so infinitely high and far away and so outside of your reach, so that even this kind of sense that you are so burdened by, they say that, like, this idea that depression, oftentimes people describe depression as being too stuck in your own personality self-narration, where you are instead of having this free, open, you have the sense of freedom and space and like ability to move, or, where you're not, the depression is being burdened into this really fixed and rigid sense of self, that you are trapped in your own biography. You're trapped in your own self-story. You're trapped in your own fragmented, isolated, individual sense of self. And the previous modes that promise some kind of experience of connection with other people, belonging to a group, or to, this kind of immersive group experience with the mass, in the same way that Marshall McLuhan, a Sun-Neptune guy is all about mass media, about, go to a sports game. You don't experience yourself, you experience you as a whole mass of people that are all wearing the same jersey, that are all cheering for the same team, all together as this unified force. But more and more times people try or go looking for that, and what they find is a reinforcement of the burden of their own personality, their own subjectivity. That I am so weighed down by the being this person, and that when I go to try to escape that, it just reinforces how separate and fragmented I am, and how heavy of a burden this feels, and how infinitely far away the release is, right? And I think that there's some kind of it will feel better in some way. Maybe it'll be less moody once we get Neptune into Aries, Saturn into Aries, get this all out of Pisces, because I think Pisces is very much about this dualism, which could be really kind of like a spiritual longing, or the pining to like transcend that boundary that keeps you locked into a really depressing state of separation or fragmented individuality. And there's some kind of complicated thing where reading McLuhan is really interesting, and putting the McLuhan spin on this, because when you think about like the online world, it is simultaneously something that promises you connection to the whole world, right? It promises you instant connection to everything else out there, but only through the vector of your own defined personality. So it simultaneously unifies you with everything else going on, but then fragments you and reinforces what makes you different compared to everybody else. And McLuhan was basically suggesting that this two-motion movement of making us all separate, but then making us all unified, is basically what creates the idea of an increased sense of tribalism. Or McLuhan also gives the example of like, urban versus rural, and the idea that in our old rural schoolhouse in the countryside used to be defined by a large area with a small population, so that the old country schoolhouse would have people that were you'd have kindergarten, elementary school, high school, all one school teacher having to do all of it, because you had it was by geography. It was about who was in the local area and catering to their needs, and you didn't have as many people that you could split off into different by their age, right? But the more urbanized we are, the more you have this sense of your experience of going to school is being sorted into a somewhat artificial situation where you are in school with a bunch of people who are exactly your age. From January to December, you have the system where you are categorized by the year into all the kids 1 year being a certain age, right? And that the idea of the way that the city is a much more urbanly dense situation compared to the countryside, you have the internet being a connection to the whole goddamn world. So if you, in the sense that in the countryside, you had all the kids, regardless of age, in the same classroom as a kind of diverse community, and then you have in an urban setting, you have them all fragmented into these different age groups. Then we have the opportunity for the entire world to be infinitely divided and fragmented along the most minutely small of differences. So that you have in your local environment with you and your neighborhood and your local community, you share basically, these people are complete strangers. They're completely alien to you. You have absolutely nothing in common with them. And then your in-group, your tribe, is like the most like micro adjusted to your specific personality, so that you can only tolerate people who think exactly the same way as you, so that you have an increasingly fragmented group of online tribalism, and that makes you even more and more less likely to tolerate the differences of the everyday people who just are around you, right? And this basically creates a situation where we are both more advanced and sophisticated than we've ever been, but then also thrown back into being the most tribalistic than we've ever been, and most likely to form these groups that are increasingly more and more complex by how they're divided, basically. That we have this sort of increased complexity based on more and more and more, points of conflict, points of tension, these micro divisions where conflicts could arise. And what's interesting is that we also seem to have less and less of an ability to tolerate any of these tensions. Like we don't have any ability to tolerate anybody having a different opinion with us, having a different point of view, having a different idea, and so we have what Byung-Chul Han calls the hell of the same. We have created a world where we are just subjecting ourselves to the hell of ourself mirrored back to us, and the longing for some kind of other that is going to represent difference in our, the idea of, so it's kind of interesting is that instead of looking to transcend the differences between self and other, we actually want the other back in our life. We want some person that we can relate to as a different person that isn't just there to play a yes man to reaffirm our own opinion and all that, right? But we don't get a transcendence unless that difference is there in the first place, right? Like you actually have to before you can have the sense of feeling the unity with all the people at the dance party. First, you have to establish yourself as something separate to them, and then you can have the overcoming of the separation as a kind of a nice ecstatic release. But there's this question of what it's possible that the initial sense of being something separate to begin with is undermined by the sense that you don't maybe we don't even have an individual sense of self to begin with. Maybe we're just a flow of different forces that we identify with and create a false ego out of, right? And then this whole false ego, the whole story of transcending, that was the whole Piscean vision of mysticism, of being me being a separate false self, and I have to get out of it by being fused. But now we for some reason this whole thing is broken down, and I think, I don't know, this is basically the vibe going into this eclipse cycle, and I think it could have something to do with this sense of with Saturn being the heavy burden of self-identification and of personality, of being that our whole idea of what mystical transcendence means is somehow it's like a coin that's lost its face, that it is a currency that doesn't mean anything anymore. And this is the kind of the meta crisis, the crisis of meaning that we are in, and the movement towards the age of Aquarius is the establishing of some kind of new order that is inherently very threatening to people like Jordan Peterson. It's threatening to people like the conservatives, because it represents the destruction, basically, and the decomposition of all the structures that we have relied on for the last 2,000 years, are just going to continue to break down and deteriorate until some new myth organically arises out of the situation that we're faced with. And I think I'll just end there. But this is some things that have been on my mind. Thanks for watching. Thanks for supporting the channel. Keep on rocking in the free world.